Right now, somewhere beneath the fluorescent lights of a Federal Reserve trading floor in Lower Manhattan, a mid-level analyst is staring at a spreadsheet that his superiors have explicitly told him never to print, never to email, and under no circumstances to discuss on a recorded line. The numbers on that screen are not classified in any legal sense. They are simply too honest for public consumption. They describe, in cold actuarial language, the precise velocity at which the financial architecture that has governed the entire planet since 1944 is coming apart at the seams, not slowly, not metaphorically, structurally, mathematically, irreversibly. And the man in the Oval Office, the man who built his entire political identity on the mythology of financial mastery, the deal maker, the leverage king, the self-proclaimed savior of American economic greatness, that man has said almost nothing coherent about it. Not a press conference, not a policy address, not even one of his characteristic social media eruptions that usually detonate within minutes of any news cycle he finds threatening to his image. On the single most consequential financial unraveling in modern history, Donald Trump has chosen something extraordinary. He has chosen near silence. And that silence, if you know how to read it, is the loudest alarm bell of all. What I am going to dissect for you today, stripping away the propaganda fog that has settled like industrial smog over every major Western newsroom, is the anatomy of a collapse that is not coming. It is already in motion. The instruments of financial control that Washington spent 80 years constructing, the dollar's reserve status, the SWIFT messaging monopoly, the IMF's structural adjustment machinery, the ability to financially asphyxiate any nation that dares to disobey, are not being challenged. They're being systematically dismantled in real time by actors Washington spent decades dismissing as economically irrelevant, and the consequences for the American working class, for the ordinary person in Ohio or Georgia or Arizona, watching their grocery bills climb and their savings dissolve, are not abstract geopolitical theory. They're arriving at the kitchen table right now. To understand why Trump's silence on this is not incompetence, but something closer to paralysis, we need to apply the scalpel of materialist analysis to the precise mechanics of how dollar hegemony actually functioned, because most people have been taught a fairy tale version of it. The official story is that the dollar became the world's reserve currency because America was the most productive, most innovative, most trustworthy economy on Earth. That is not false exactly, but it is catastrophically incomplete. The deeper truth is that dollar dominance was enforced, not earned. It was maintained through a system of interlocking coercions, petrodollar agreements that forced sovereign nations to purchase American currency simply to buy energy, trade agreements structured to ensure that any nation accumulating export surpluses had no choice but to park those surpluses in U.S. Treasury bonds, and a network of financial penalties for any country that attempted to price its exports in alternative currencies. This was not a free market. It was a protection racket with excellent public relations. Now ask yourself something, and I want you to write your honest answer in the comments below. Do you believe the US dollar will still be the world's dominant reserve currency in 10 years? Yes, no, or something more complicated? Write it down. I read every single comment. The racket functioned beautifully for decades because there was no credible alternative architecture. The Soviet ruble was never convertible at scale. The euro was too structurally fragile, too politically fractured to serve as a genuine challenger. And China, for most of the late 20th century, was content to play within Washington's system while quietly accumulating the industrial capacity and foreign exchange reserves that would eventually make the system optional. rather than obligatory. The fatal error Washington made was confusing dependency with loyalty. The nations that held dollar reserves and bought treasury bonds were not doing so out of admiration for American values. They were doing so because there was no exit door. The moment someone built an exit door, the dynamic would change entirely. And someone built the exit door, what the Western financial press describes, when it condescends to describe it at all, as China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the expansion of BRICS, or Russia's post-2022 pivot to alternative payment systems, is consistently framed as geopolitical ambition, as authoritarian expansionism, as a threat to the liberal international order. What it actually represents, stripped of the ideological varnish, is the construction of a parallel financial infrastructure. Trade settlement systems that bypass SWIFT, currency swap lines denominated in yuan and rubles, a new development bank offering sovereign loans without the IMF's structural adjustment conditionalities, the conditionalities that have historically meant cutting food subsidies, privatizing water utilities, and suppressing wages as the price of financial rescue. The infrastructure is not complete, it is not seamless, but it is functional. And functional is all it needed to be to break the monopoly. You don't need a perfect substitute to end a monopoly. You only need a viable alternative. Here is where the story becomes devastating for the American domestic economy. And this is the part that the cable news cycle, buried in its daily theater of culture war and electoral spectacle, systematically refuses to connect. The dollar's reserve status was not merely an instrument of foreign policy, it was the fundamental mechanism by which the United States exported its inflation. When Washington printed trillions of dollars to finance the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, to bail out the criminal financial class after 2008, to fund the pandemic stimulus packages, those dollars did not all stay inside the American economy, creating domestic price pressure. A massive proportion flowed outward, absorbed by foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds that needed dollars to conduct international trade. This absorption acted as a pressure valve, a safety mechanism that allowed Washington to run perpetual deficits without immediately destroying the purchasing power of working-class Americans. The moment global demand for dollar reserves begins contracting, and it is contracting measurably, trackably, undeniably, that pressure valve closes. The inflation that was being exported comes home, and the working person in Pittsburgh or Phoenix discovers that the price of eggs, of rent, of healthcare is not the result of corporate greed alone. It is the direct consequence of an empire that spent its own structural foundation to maintain military and financial supremacy abroad. This is the economic reality that Trump either does not understand or understands too well to discuss publicly. His tariff policy, framed as nationalist industrial revival, is in practice an accelerant poured on the fire. Every tariff escalation, every trade war provocation, every ultimatum delivered to allied and rival nations alike accelerates the timeline on which those nations decide that the cost of dollar dependency outweighs its benefits. Mexico, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. These are not ideological adversaries of the United States. They are pragmatic sovereign actors performing rational cost-benefit calculations, and increasingly the calculation is pointing east. Let's slow down for a moment, because I want to know something from you personally, and I need you to write this in the comments right now. Where are you watching this video from? What country? What city? Because What I'm describing is not an American story, it is a global story, and I want to understand exactly who is in this audience and how this process is affecting your daily life where you live. The mechanism by which financial control actually collapses is never the dramatic single moment that Hollywood would script. It does not happen as one cataclysmic day when traders storm the exchanges and the system implodes in visible fire. It happens the way a structural beam corrodes, invisibly, incrementally, until one unremarkable morning, the weight it was carrying becomes unsupportable. The indicators are already visible to anyone willing to look at them without the filter of institutional optimism. Central banks globally have been reducing their treasury bond holdings and increasing their gold reserves at a pace not seen since the immediate post-World War II period. The BRICS nations collectively now represent a larger share of global GDP by purchasing power parity than the G7. The share of global trade settled in dollars has been declining for 6 consecutive years. These are not opinion pieces. These are trackable, auditable, publicly available data points that the mainstream financial media acknowledges individually but systematically refuses to synthesize into the coherent narrative they constitute. Why does the synthesis not happen? Because the synthesis is inconvenient for the institutional class that controls the editorial infrastructure of American financial media. The editors and anchors and senior analysts of Bloomberg, CNBC, The Wall Street Journal. These individuals are not stupid. They understand the data, but their professional incentive structure, their access to corporate advertising revenue, their relationship with Treasury officials and Fed governors who provide them with exclusive briefings in exchange for favorable framing, creates a systemic bias toward reassurance. Their job, in functional terms, is to prevent the kind of coordinated loss of confidence that would accelerate the very process they are paid not to fully describe. So, they discuss each symptom in isolation. Rising gold prices get a segment about inflation hedging. The yuan's expanding trade role gets a segment about China's geopolitical ambitions. The declining Treasury auction demand gets a brief technical note buried in the bond market section. And the audience, receiving each fragment without the architecture connecting them, does not see the cathedral. They see individual bricks. What makes the current moment uniquely dangerous for Washington's financial establishment is not merely the external construction of alternative systems, it is the internal decay of the institutions that were supposed to maintain credibility. The Federal Reserve since 2008 has operated in a condition that no mainstream economist's model had ever seriously stress-tested. Permanent crisis management mode, zero interest rates for over a decade, quantitative easing programs that expanded the Fed's balance sheet from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. Then, when inflation finally arrived as the inevitable consequence of that monetary expansion colliding with post-pandemic supply chain disruption, an emergency rate hiking cycle that was too aggressive to be painless and too belated to be decisive. The Fed is not a neutral technocratic institution managing the business cycle. It has become the life support machine for a financialized economy that long ago abandoned the productive industrial base that gave the dollar its original, legitimate claim to global leadership. Trump knows this in the visceral, intuitive way that a real estate developer who has leveraged himself to the absolute edge understands debt dynamics. He has lived inside the logic of financial overextension. He knows what it looks like when the collateral stops supporting the loan. And he knows that the honest public accounting of what has been done to the American monetary system would require him to implicate not only his democratic predecessors, but his own first term, during which the national debt increased by roughly $8 trillion and the tax cuts he championed disproportionately enriched the financial class whose asset inflation the Fed was subsidizing. So, the silence is not mysterious. It is structurally determined. To speak truthfully about the collapse of financial control would require him to narrate a story in which he is not the hero riding to the rescue, but one of the actors who accelerated the decline. The international dimension of this silence is even more revealing. The nations that are most aggressively building dollar-alternative financial infrastructure are precisely the nations that Trump has chosen to approach with the bluntest, most confrontational diplomatic instruments available. Tariff ultimatums, military threats, demands for territorial concessions framed as economic negotiation. This approach might have been coherent in 1995 when dollar dependency gave Washington genuine coercive leverage over almost every significant economy on Earth. In 2026, it is strategically catastrophic. Every tariff threat delivered to a BRICS-adjacent nation is a recruitment pitch for the alternative system. Every financial ultimatum that cannot be backed by genuine economic benefits accelerates the timeline on which pragmatic sovereign actors decide that the dollar relationship is a liability rather than an asset. Trump is attempting to use the instruments of a hegemony that is already hollow, and the hollowness is becoming visible to the nations he is attempting to coerce. The domestic political economy of this moment is where the human stakes become undeniable and urgent. The American working class, the constituency Trump has consistently claimed as his political base, is living inside the consequences of this structural decay in the most intimate and inescapable way. Home ownership, the foundational asset of middle-class wealth accumulation in 20th century America, has become effectively inaccessible for anyone under 40 without pre-existing family wealth. The combination of elevated interest rates, supply-constrained housing markets, and decades of wage stagnation relative to asset price inflation has created a permanent renter class in a country that built its social mythology around property ownership. Healthcare costs consume a proportion of household income that would have been considered a national emergency if it had arrived suddenly rather than incrementally. Higher education debt functions as a form of indentured economic servitude that delays family formation, suppresses consumer spending, and concentrates wealth among the financial institutions collecting interest on those obligations. These are not policy failures in the conventional sense. They are the predictable, inevitable outputs of a financial system that was redesigned beginning in the 1980s to transfer wealth upward from wage earners to capital holders with maximum efficiency. The dollar's reserve status enabled this process by allowing the government to run the deficits that provided the fiscal stimulus, masking the underlying decline in productive wages. As that enabling mechanism contracts, the masking function disappears. The pain that was deferred is arriving, and the political class, including the president who promised most loudly to reverse it, has no coherent response, because an honest response would require dismantling the financial architecture from which the donor class that funds their campaigns extracts its returns. I want to ask you one final thing before we go deeper into where this leads, and please write your answer below because it genuinely shapes how I structure the next part of this analysis. Do you think there is any political figure anywhere in the world right now who actually has a credible plan to manage this transition without catastrophic disruption to ordinary people? Name them if you believe so, or tell me why you think no such figure exists. What comes next, if the trajectory is not interrupted by some dramatic policy reversal that currently has no political champion, is not a single crash. It is a prolonged, uneven, geographically distributed process of imperial fiscal contraction that will feel different depending on where you sit in the global economic hierarchy. For Americans, particularly working-class Americans, it will feel like a permanent reduction in purchasing power relative to the rest of the world. The goods and energy and raw materials that dollar hegemony allowed the United States to purchase at artificially advantageous prices will become more expensive as the currency premium erodes. The social programs that were financed through deficit spending, enabled by foreign appetite for treasury bonds, will face existential pressure as that appetite shrinks and the cost of borrowing rises. The military infrastructure that both enforced and symbolized American global dominance will strain against a fiscal reality that can no longer sustain it at current scale. For the nations of the global South, the transition carries both enormous promise and genuine danger. The promise is real. The construction of alternative financial infrastructure genuinely does reduce the coercive leverage that Washington has used for decades to extract structural adjustment compliance, to suppress industrial development, to enforce commodity export dependency. The danger is equally real. The capital filling the vacuum is not philanthropic. It seeks returns. The terms it offers may be more respectful of sovereignty and more compatible with industrial development than the IMF's terms, but capital accumulation logic does not disappear simply because the capital is denominated in yuan rather than dollars. The liberation from one dependency requires vigilance against the construction of another. The financial control that is collapsing was never simply a set of technical monetary arrangements. It was the material foundation of a specific global class structure, one in which a financial oligarchy concentrated primarily, but not exclusively, in the United States and Western Europe, extracted returns from the labor and resources of the entire planet through the mechanism of currency monopoly and debt dependency. The collapse of that control does not automatically produce justice. It produces a transition period of extraordinary volatility during which the class forces contending for control of the new architecture will determine whether the outcome is genuinely multipolar and developmentally equitable, or simply a different configuration of extraction with new dominant actors. Trump's silence on this is, in the end, a confession, not a conscious one, not a calculated one. It is the confession of a political figure whose entire ideological formation was calibrated to a world that is ending, who possesses neither the theoretical framework nor the material political will to honestly describe the transition, and whose instinctive response to systemic challenge is the tactic of the corner debtor. Make noise, create distraction, threaten the creditors, and hope that the reckoning can be postponed past the next electoral cycle. The reckoning, this time, does not appear to be in a postponing mood. The train has left the station. The track ahead is different from any track the Empire has traveled before, and the conductor is not in the cab.